I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through quiet humiliation or learned to swallow your pain to keep the peace, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. Your stories matter, and so does what you're about to hear. I remember the smell of orchids and polished marble more clearly than I remember my own reflection that day. The ballroom was carved out of money and expectation, every surface gleaming, every guest dressed as if they belonged to a different world than the one I grew up in. I stood there in my wedding dress, hands folded neatly at my waist, listening to the hum of voices that didn't include me, and I felt like a guest at my own life. Not because I wasn't loved by my husband, I was, but because his family had made it very clear that love to them came with the hierarchy, and I was at the bottom of it. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitcomb, had perfected a smile that could pass for kindness from across a room. Up close, it had edges. She'd greeted guests all evening with the ease of someone born into abundance, gliding from table to table, her pearls catching the light as if they'd been rehearsing for this moment all their lives. When she reached me, she leaned in and kissed the air near my cheek. "You look radiant," she said, her eyes flicking to my dress, then back to my face, as if she were assessing a purchase. "Who would have thought, given where you started?" It was the first cut of the night, and it wasn't meant to be the last. She said it softly enough that only I could hear, but loudly enough that the women nearest us leaned in, curiosity sharpening their smiles. I answered with a nod, the kind you learn when you grow up knowing that answering back only gives people permission to dig deeper. My father taught me that. He worked double shifts at the depot, came home with oil under his nails and pride in his spine, and he used to say, "Baby, don't let anyone make you prove your worth to them. You'll spend your whole life doing it." Eleanor didn't know that about me. She knew the bullet points she'd collected like gossip currency. Public school, scholarship student, first in my family to graduate college. She knew my mother had cleaned houses when I was young, that my father's hands were rough, that our dinners were simple, and our dreams were big. She told herself those facts meant something about my character, and that night, with champagne flowing and an audience assembled, she decided to make a show of it. When it was time for the speeches, she insisted on going first. The band quieted, forks stilled against plates, and she took the microphone as if it were a scepter. "Family and friends," she began, voice smooth as silk, "we are gathered to celebrate a union that bridges two very different worlds." Laughter rippled politely through the room. I felt my husband's hand tighten around mine. He leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm sorry," but I squeezed back, steady. This was not the moment to break. Eleanor continued, telling stories about her son's childhood, his first pony, his boarding school mishaps. Then she turned toward me, eyes bright. "And then he met our bride, a young woman with resilience, a woman who knows how to work hard because she had to." She paused, letting the implication bloom. "It's inspiring, really, how far someone can come." The room laughed again, warmer this time, comfortable in their shared understanding. I smiled because I knew how to smile through it. I'd smiled through teachers who assumed I couldn't keep up, through classmates who asked if my parents could afford field trips, through interviewers who complimented my grit as if it were a consolation prize. I smiled because smiling kept me intact. What Eleanor didn't see was the way some people looked away. My aunt pressed her lips together. My mother's eyes shone, not with tears, but with something harder, pride sharpened by pain. and my husband's jaw set in a way I recognized. He'd heard these jokes before. He'd fought them in private. Tonight, Eleanor decided privacy was overrated. After her speech, applause filled the room. Eleanor returned to her seat, satisfied, and the band struck up a soft interlude while servers cleared plates. I felt the weight of the microphone being passed to me like a held breath. This was the part I'd prepared for quietly, over months of small slights and well-meaning warnings. People had told me to let it go, to keep the peace, to remember that marrying into a family like this required compromise. They'd said dignity meant endurance. I'd learned something different. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked to the center of the room. The lights were warm on my face. I could see the long tables, the crystal glasses, the eyes that expected gratitude, humility, a carefully measured thank you. I took a breath, the way my father taught me before a hard conversation, and I began. I want to thank everyone for being here, I said, voice steady. This room is filled with people who have shaped the lives of the man I love, and I'm grateful for that. I paused, letting my gaze settle on Eleanor, then drift beyond her. I also want to talk about beginnings. A murmur moved through the crowd. I continued. Some beginnings are gilded, some are modest. Mine were humble, yes, but they were rich in ways that don't always show up on balance sheets. I spoke of my parents' sacrifices, of nights studying by a kitchen light while my mother slept before an early shift, of learning early that kindness and discipline were not opposites. I spoke calmly, without bitterness, and the room leaned in. I learned to listen, I said. I learned to observe, and I learned that silence doesn't mean ignorance. Eleanor shifted in her seat. It was subtle, but I saw it. I went on. I also learned that the stories we tell about ourselves and others have a way of catching up with us. There it was, the hinge. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't named names, but the air changed. People straightened. The band members glanced at each other. My husband watched me with a mix of worry and awe because he knew there were things about his family I knew that others didn't. Things I'd learned not by digging, but by paying attention, by being the girl from humble beginnings who noticed when numbers didn't add up, when timelines shifted, when gratitude was demanded but never returned. I finished that first part of my speech by thanking my husband for choosing partnership over performance. Applause came, uncertain at first, then fuller. I handed the microphone back, returned to my seat, and felt my pulse in my ears. The reckoning hadn't happened yet, not fully, but the door was open, and Eleanor knew it. I could see it in the way her smile didn't quite come back, in the way she avoided my eyes for the rest of dinner. She thought she'd survived it. She didn't know the truth had already started to walk. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. The music grew louder after dinner, as if the band was trying to smooth over what had settled into the room like fine dust. People stood, clinked glasses, returned to safe conversations about travel plans and business deals. From a distance, it probably looked like any other high society wedding, but I could feel the undercurrent. Eleanor's words hadn't just embarrassed me, they had reminded everyone that class was the invisible guest at our table, and no one quite knew where to seat it anymore. I excused myself to the terrace, needing air. The night was cool, the city lights blinking beyond the hedges like distant witnesses. I leaned against the stone railing and let my shoulders drop. That was when my mother came out to join me. She didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arm around my back the way she used to when I was small and scared of thunderstorms. "You okay?" she asked finally. I nodded. "I am. I didn't think she'd do it so openly." My mother let out a soft, humorless laugh. People like her don't think they're being cruel. They think they're being honest." She looked at me, eyes steady. "Your father would be proud of you tonight." That nearly undid me. I swallowed and looked back through the glass doors into the ballroom. Eleanor was laughing now, animated, telling a story to a cluster of guests who nodded eagerly. She hadn't changed. She probably never would. What she didn't know was that the foundation she stood on had cracks she'd spent years pretending weren't there. I didn't learn Eleanor's secrets all at once. They revealed themselves over time in fragments, the way truth usually does. I married into the Whitcomb family after dating my husband, Daniel, for 3 years. In that time, I'd watched Eleanor maneuver conversations away from certain years, certain names. I'd seen how she bristled when Daniel asked about his father's early business ventures, how she dismissed my questions about the family's charitable foundation with vague answers. I wasn't suspicious at first, I just paid attention. My education had trained me for it. I worked as a financial analyst, a job Eleanor loved to mention at parties because it sounded respectable without threatening her sense of superiority. What she didn't realize was that numbers have a way of telling stories people don't want told. Patterns repeat, gaps appear, and sometimes, if you care enough to look, you see where someone else's success is stitched together with borrowed thread. Daniel knew pieces of it. He knew his father, Thomas, had struggled early on, that a friend of the family had helped him get his first major contract. He didn't know that the friend was actually my father. He didn't know because Eleanor had made sure no one talked about that chapter. She'd reframed history so thoroughly that even Thomas seemed to believe it. Years ago, before I met Daniel, my father had worked logistics for a small manufacturing company that later became one of Whitcomb Industries' earliest partners. When the company was on the brink of collapse, my father took a risk, rerouted shipments, called in favors, and essentially saved the contract that allowed Thomas to secure his first big client. My father never asked for recognition. He believed in helping quietly. He believed good would come back around. It did, just not the way he expected. After the company stabilized, Thomas cut ties, restructured, and Eleanor made sure my father's contribution was written out of the narrative. No lawsuit, no public fight, just a door closing softly. My father never spoke of it bitterly. He used to say, "Some people measure wealth by what they keep, others by what they give." He believed that, dying. I learned the full truth accidentally years later when I recognized a name in old paperwork Eleanor had left on her desk. I didn't confront her. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I sat with it, waited, and decided what it meant. It meant that Eleanor's mockery of my humble beginnings wasn't just cruel, it was hypocritical. Back inside the ballroom, the speeches had resumed. Daniel's best man spoke, then my aunt. There was laughter, clapping, relief. Eleanor avoided me, but I could feel her awareness like a hand at my back. When it was time for the father-daughter dance, she watched from her seat, eyes shining with something like nostalgia. I wondered if she remembered the man she'd erased. I wondered if she ever thought about the cost of maintaining her version of the story. Later, as the night wound down, Eleanor cornered me near the dessert table. "That was quite a speech," she said, smile tight, very heartfelt. "Thank you," I replied. She tilted her head. "You didn't need to make things uncomfortable." I met her gaze. "I didn't. I spoke my truth." Her eyes narrowed. "Be careful," she said softly. "People don't like having their stories questioned." I thought of my father, of the way he'd shrugged off injustice because he believed in something bigger than recognition. I thought of my mother, standing tall beside me, unashamed of the life they'd built. "I think," I said, "people don't like realizing they're standing on someone else's silence." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned away. I knew then that the reckoning would not come from a confrontation in a hallway. It would come from daylight, from witnesses, from truth delivered calmly, without spite. The next morning, as Daniel and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon, he asked me if everything was okay. We sat on the edge of the bed, suitcases open, the world temporarily paused. I told him then. Not everything, but enough. I told him about my father's role, about the missing chapter in their family story. He listened without interrupting, his face a study in shock and sorrow. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. I needed to be sure, and I needed to decide what kind of future we were building. I didn't want secrets between us. He nodded slowly. "My mother," he said, "always told me success was earned, that we deserved everything we had." "I believe in earning," I said. "I just also believe in acknowledging who helped you stand up." He took my hands. "What do you want to do?" The question mattered. It meant he was choosing partnership even when it was uncomfortable. I squeezed his fingers. "I want the truth to be known, not as revenge, as restoration." We returned from our honeymoon to a flurry of postponed conversations. Eleanor called, her voice strained, asking to meet. Thomas sent an email, polite, distant. I suggested a family dinner, neutral ground, witnesses. Daniel agreed. That night, I laid out documents on the table, contracts, correspondence, timelines. I spoke calmly, respectfully, the way I would in any professional setting. Eleanor tried to interrupt, to minimize, to redirect. Thomas stared at the papers, his face draining of color. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't remember it like this." "Memory," I replied gently, "can be edited. Records can't." The room was silent. Eleanor stood abruptly, chair scraping. "This is unnecessary," she snapped. "Why dig up the past?" I looked at her, really looked, not with anger, with clarity. "Because the past is still paying interest," I said, "and because dignity isn't inherited, it's practiced." I wasn't triumphant. I was tired, but I felt something settle into place. The truth was out, not shouted, not weaponized, simply offered, undeniable. In the weeks that followed, things shifted. The family foundation was audited. A quiet acknowledgement was made. My father's name was added to a plaque, small but real. Eleanor withdrew, her social circle tightening. She never apologized. I didn't expect her to. What mattered was that the narrative had changed. On a quiet evening months later, Daniel and I sat together watching the sunset from our modest home. He turned to me and said, "You know, they used to say you married up." I smiled. "Did I?" He shook his head. "No, we married forward." And in that moment, I understood the true lesson of that wedding day. Dignity is the real wealth. Silence can be powerful, but truth, spoken with grace, endures. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. After that dinner, after the documents were packed away and the silence had finally been broken, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. Truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it seeps. Sometimes it rearranges lives quietly, forcing people to sit with themselves in ways they've avoided for decades. That was what began to happen inside the Whitcomb family, and I was both inside it and strangely apart from it. Eleanor stopped calling me by my name for a while. When she had to refer to me, she used Daniel's wife, as if withholding my name could shrink my presence. I let her. I'd spent too much of my life fighting to be seen. Now I knew that visibility didn't require permission. Daniel noticed it, of course. He always did. He asked if it hurt, and I told him the truth. It didn't hurt the way her mockery had hurt at the wedding. This was different. This was a retreat, and retreats don't wound as deeply as attacks. Thomas, on the other hand, changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. He began asking questions, real ones, about my father, about the early years, about what had been lost when gratitude was replaced with entitlement. We'd sit across from each other, coffee cooling between us, and I'd watch a man in his 60s grapple with the possibility that his success story wasn't as clean as he'd believed. He never asked me to soften it for him. For that, I respected him. One afternoon, months after the wedding, he invited Daniel and me to walk through one of the company's older warehouses. It was slated for renovation, a relic from the early days. Dust hung in the air, and the concrete floor bore scars from years of use. Thomas stopped near a loading dock and stared at the empty space for a long time. "This is where it started," he said quietly. "Your father stood right there, didn't he?" I nodded. I'd seen the photographs. Yes. Thomas swallowed. "I don't know how I forgot." I didn't answer, because sometimes forgetting is a choice people make one small step at a time. Instead, I said, "Remembering now matters." Eleanor never came on those walks. She kept her distance, hosting smaller dinners, cultivating sympathy in subtle ways. I heard through the family grapevine that she told people I was overly sensitive, that I'd misunderstood jokes, that my background made me defensive. It was almost funny how predictable it was. When power is challenged, it often pretends it was misunderstood. What surprised me was how many people stopped believing her, not because of me, but because of the way truth has a way of aligning details. Old acquaintances remembered my father. Former employees remembered favors. The story Eleanor had controlled so carefully began to fray, not from confrontation, but from consistency. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't accused. I'd simply refused to carry someone else's lie. Daniel struggled during this period. I could see it in the way he grew quiet after calls with his mother, in the way he hesitated before family gatherings. One night, as we lay in bed, he said, "I feel like I'm betraying her." I turned toward him. "By telling the truth?" "By not defending her," he said. "She raised me. She taught me to believe in excellence." I placed my hand on his heart. "She also taught you to believe in appearances," I said gently. "Those aren't the same thing." He closed his eyes. "I don't know how to hold both." "You don't have to. You can honor what she gave you without protecting what harmed others." That was a turning point for us. We began talking more openly about boundaries, about the kind of family culture we wanted to build. We decided that silence would no longer be our default response to cruelty, even when it came wrapped in politeness. It was uncomfortable work, but it felt honest. The first real test came at a charity gala 6 months later. Whitcomb Industries was sponsoring the event, and Daniel was expected to attend. Eleanor would be there, of course, along with many of the same faces from our wedding. I considered not going. It would have been easy to claim work or illness, but something in me knew avoidance would hand Eleanor a quiet victory. So I went. The ballroom was smaller than our wedding venue, but no less ornate. Eleanor spotted us almost immediately. She approached with practiced grace, kissed Daniel's cheek, and offered me a nod. "I hear you've been busy," she said. "I have. Life has a way of asking more of us when we stop pretending." She smiled thinly. "You should be careful. Not everyone appreciates disruption." I thought of my father, of the way his life had been disrupted by generosity, by believing in people who later erased him. Disruption isn't always destructive. Sometimes it's corrective. She turned away then, seeking safer company. Throughout the evening, I noticed something else. People approached me, quietly. They thanked me for my speech, for my calm, for saying what they'd felt but never dared articulate. One woman squeezed my hand and whispered, "You reminded us what class really looks like." By the end of the night, Eleanor was isolated at her table, her laughter forced, her circle thinner. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt relief. There's a difference. Satisfaction seeks punishment. Relief comes from alignment. Weeks later, a letter arrived at our home. It was from Eleanor, short, formal. She wrote that she disagreed with my interpretation of events, but acknowledged that harm had been done. She did not apologize. She did not mention my father by name, but she ended with a sentence that surprised me. I am learning that control is not the same as respect. I read it twice, then folded it carefully. Growth doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it comes begrudgingly, trailing pride behind it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The conversation had moved beyond words. The final chapter of this reckoning came quietly on a Sunday afternoon when my mother and I sat together shelling peas. She'd come to visit, and the kitchen smelt like home. She listened as I told her everything, the gala, the letter, the slow shifts. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Your father always said the truth didn't need a spotlight, just time." I thought about that wedding day again, about the way Eleanor had mocked my humble beginnings as if they were a weakness, about how she'd never imagined that humility could coexist with strength. I realized then that my story wasn't about revenge at all. It was about refusing to inherit someone else's shame. When Daniel came home that evening, he found me at the table, peas neatly piled, my heart lighter than it had been in months. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I finally am." He kissed my forehead. "Me too." Our marriage settled into something solid after that. Not perfect, real. We learned to navigate family gatherings with clarity, to leave when conversations turned cruel, to stay when dialogue felt possible. We built traditions that honored where we came from and where we were going. And sometimes, late at night, Daniel would ask me if I regretted speaking up at the wedding. I never did. Because dignity, I learned, doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to humiliate to teach a lesson. It simply stands, steady and unashamed, and waits for the world to catch up. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from. Right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed. The smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. By the time the first anniversary of our wedding approached, the story had changed hands so many times it barely resembled the version Eleanor once controlled. That didn't mean the damage was undone. It meant it was acknowledged. There's a difference, and I learned to recognize it in the way people spoke more carefully now, the way jokes about backgrounds and breeding lost their audience. The room had learned something, even if not everyone liked the lesson. Daniel and I decided to mark our anniversary quietly. No gala, no extended family, just a weekend away at a small lakeside inn, the kind of place my parents would have chosen. As we packed, Eleanor called. Daniel answered on speaker, his expression cautious. "I won't keep you," she said. "I just wanted to say, I hear you're celebrating." "We are," Daniel replied. A pause. "I'd like to see you when you return, both of you." After the call ended, Daniel looked at me. "Do you want to?" I thought about it, about everything we'd been through. "Yes," I said finally, "but on our terms." The meeting took place in Eleanor's living room, a space that once intimidated me with its oil paintings and heirloom furniture. That afternoon, it felt smaller. Eleanor sat across from us, hands folded tightly in her lap. Thomas was there too, quieter than usual. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, "about what happened, about what you said, and about what I did." She hesitated, as if unused to the terrain. "I was afraid that if people saw how much help we received, how much we owed, they would think less of us, of me." The honesty surprised me, not because I doubted it, but because she was finally saying it out loud. Fear has a way of shrinking people, even when they appear large. She nodded. "I can't change what I did, but I can stop pretending it was harmless. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was closer than I'd expected. I accepted it for what it was, a step. Afterwards, Thomas asked me if I'd considered joining the board of the family foundation. He said, "We need perspectives we've ignored and integrity we've taken for granted." I told him I'd think about it. Later, when Daniel and I talked it through, we decided I would accept conditionally transparency, accountability, and a commitment to honoring contributors past and present. It wasn't about power, it was about repair. Serving on the board changed how I saw influence. It's quieter than people imagine. It's in the questions you ask, the pauses you insist on, the names you refuse to let be forgotten. We initiated a scholarship in my father's name, not as a favor to me, but as an acknowledgement of the countless unseen hands that build legacies. The announcement was modest. Eleanor attended. She applauded. I watched her that day, and I understood something important. Redemption doesn't always come with warmth. Sometimes it comes with restraint, with learning when to stop steaking. Not everyone welcomed the changes. There were murmurs about outsiders and new directions. I let them murmur. I learned that not all discomfort needs to be soothed. Some of it signals growth. One evening, after a long board meeting, I walked home alone. The city was loud, alive. I passed a group of young women laughing on a corner, their clothes inexpensive, their confidence radiant. I saw myself in them, not because of where they stood, but because of how they stood, unapologetic, forward-facing. When I got home, my mother had left a voicemail. "Your father would have liked this," she said. Not the money part, the remembering. I sat on the couch and let that sink in. Remembering. That was the heart of it. Not revenge, not humiliation. Restoration of truth, dignity returned to its rightful owners. Eleanor and I settled into a cautious peace. She no longer made comments about my past. When she spoke of me to others, she used my name. It seems small. It isn't. Naming is recognition. At a family dinner months later, someone made a joke about old money versus new. Eleanor cleared her throat and said, "There's nothing old about generosity." The table fell quiet. I met her eyes, surprised. She nodded once. That was enough. Daniel noticed it too. On the drive home, he said, "She's changing." I replied, "She's adjusting. Change takes longer." Our marriage deepened in the wake of all this. We learned that love isn't proven by silence, but by alignment, by choosing what's right even when it's inconvenient. We fought sometimes, of course, about boundaries, about how much to engage, but we fought fairly, anchored by shared values. On the anniversary of my father's passing, we visited his grave. Daniel stood beside me as I placed flowers, simple ones. "I wish he could see this," Daniel said. I replied, "He can, in the ways that matter." As we walked back to the car, I thought again of the wedding day, of Eleanor's smile, sharp with superiority, of my calm voice carrying a truth she never expected to hear. I realized that moment was less about exposing secrets and more about reclaiming narrative, about refusing to let humility be mistaken for weakness. If there's a moral here, it's this: dignity doesn't need to announce itself. It waits, and when the time comes, it speaks just enough to be heard. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed. The smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. By the second year of our marriage, the ripples from that wedding day had settled into a new pattern. Not calm exactly, but steadier. The kind of steadiness that comes after a storm when you're still alert, still aware of how quickly the sky can change, but no longer bracing for lightning. Life had resumed its ordinary rhythms, work deadlines, family birthdays, quiet mornings with coffee. But underneath it all, there was a clarity I hadn't known before. I knew who I was, I knew what I would tolerate, and I knew what I wouldn't. Serving on the foundation board brought me into rooms I'd once only passed through as a guest. Now I sat at the table not as an ornament, but as a participant. I asked questions that slowed conversations down. I pushed for audits, for community partnerships that weren't just photo opportunities. Some members appreciated it. Others didn't hide their irritation. I didn't take it personally. Discomfort, I'd learned, often masquerades as resistance when people are asked to live up to the image they've curated. Eleanor attended those meetings less frequently. When she did, she was restrained, observant. She rarely challenged me directly. Instead, she watched how others responded, how decisions shifted. Power, when it's no longer unquestioned, becomes cautious. One afternoon, after a particularly long session, she asked if we could talk privately. We walked out into the courtyard, the fountain humming softly between us. "You've changed this place," she said, not accusing, not praising. "Change was overdue," I replied. She nodded. "I spent my life believing control was safety, that if I curated every detail, no one could hurt us." She looked at the water. I didn't see how much harm that caused. I considered her words carefully. Control doesn't prevent pain, it just decides who absorbs it. She flinched, then sighed. I absorbed very little. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. With Eleanor, that was significant. I didn't rush to comfort her. I'd learned that growth needs space, not reassurance. Around that time, Daniel and I began talking about children. The conversations were tentative at first, threaded with questions about legacy and influence. "I don't want them growing up thinking worth is inherited," Daniel said one night, staring at the ceiling. "They won't," I told him. "We'll teach them that worth is practiced." The idea of parenthood sharpened my understanding of what we'd been through. This wasn't just about correcting the past, it was about shaping the future, about deciding what stories would be told and which ones would finally be put to rest. When I told my mother we were thinking about it, she smiled in that knowing way of hers. "You'll raise them strong," she said, "not because you're tough, because you're honest." That summer, the foundation hosted an event honoring community leaders. One of the honorees was a woman who'd grown up in foster care and built a successful nonprofit. As she spoke about resilience and support, I glanced at Eleanor. She listened intently, hands folded, eyes thoughtful. Afterward, she approached the woman and thanked her, not with platitudes, but with genuine curiosity. I watched the exchange from a distance, and for the first time, I felt something like cautious hope. Later that evening, Eleanor found me. "You would have dismissed her once," she said quietly. "I thought struggle was something to rise above, not learn from." "And now?" I asked. "And now I'm not so sure," she replied. Change, I realized, is rarely a straight line. It curves, it pauses, it backtracks, but when it happens in the open, it matters. Not everyone in the extended family adapted as well. There were cousins who kept their distance, uncles who made snide remarks about new values. I let them. We attended fewer gatherings, prioritized the ones that felt respectful. Boundaries became easier to enforce once we stopped explaining them. One evening, after declining an invitation, Daniel said, "Do you think we're arrogant now?" I smiled sadly. "Probably. People who mistake humility for weakness often confuse boundaries with arrogance." He laughed, relieved. "I'm glad you're on my side." "I'm glad you chose a side," I replied. The true test came unexpectedly when a journalist contacted me for an interview about the Foundation's new initiatives. The publication had reach. It would be an opportunity to publicly acknowledge contributors like my father. I brought it to the board. The discussion was tense. Some worried about reopening old narratives. Others saw the value in transparency. Eleanor surprised everyone. "We should do it," she said. "If our story can't withstand the truth, it doesn't deserve to be told." The room went quiet. I met her gaze, and she held it. That was new. The interview went forward. It was measured, respectful. My father's role was acknowledged without drama. The response was overwhelmingly positive. After it was published, my mother called me, her voice thick with emotion. "They said his name," she whispered. "They said it out loud." "Yes," I said, "they did." That night, Daniel and I sat on the porch, the air warm, cicadas singing. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd stayed quiet?" he asked. "I did, often. I think we'd be smaller. Not poorer, smaller." He nodded. "I don't want small. Neither do I." As the years passed, the wedding story became something people referenced carefully as a turning point. New spouses entered the family with fewer illusions and more space to be themselves. I made a point of welcoming them, of sharing pieces of my story when it felt right, not as a warning, but as an invitation to honesty. On a quiet afternoon, Eleanor visited us unannounced. She brought a box. Inside were old photographs, early company days, candid shots. She handed me one of my father, younger, smiling beside Thomas. "I thought you should have these," she said. "Thank you," I replied, meaning it. As she left, I realized that while she might never fully undo what she'd done, she was no longer guarding the lie, and that was something. Looking back, I see now that my revenge, if you could call it that, was never about exposing secrets to destroy someone. It was about letting truth breathe, about allowing dignity to take up space in rooms where it had been denied. The wedding was a reckoning, yes, but it was also a beginning, one that taught me this: you don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your story. You just need the courage to tell it. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. Time has a way of sanding down the sharpest edges, but it also polishes what's real. By the 3rd year of our marriage, the Whitcomb name no longer carried the same weight it once did in my chest. It had become just that, a name, not a verdict, not a measure of my worth. I moved through rooms with ease now, not because I belonged to them, but because I no longer needed their permission. Work kept me busy. The foundation expanded its programs, and with growth came scrutiny. We welcomed it. Transparency, once feared, became our strongest defense. I watched as younger staff members spoke more freely, no longer afraid to challenge assumptions. Culture, I learned, isn't set by policies alone. It's set by what's tolerated, and what we stopped tolerating mattered. Eleanor's presence in my life shifted again during this time. She reached out more often, not with agendas, but with questions about my mother, about how I balanced ambition and rest. One afternoon, she asked me how it felt to grow up without certainty. The question caught me off guard. "It taught me to trust myself," I said after a moment. "When nothing is guaranteed, you learn to build from the inside." She nodded slowly. "I never had to do that." "No," I agreed, "but you can still learn." She smiled faintly. It was the first time her smile felt unguarded. Daniel noticed the change too. "She listens now," he said one evening, "really listens." I replied, "Listening is harder than speaking, especially when you're used to being heard." That summer, we found out I was pregnant. The news arrived quietly, a thin blue line on a stick, a moment that rewrote everything. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, hands shaking, heart full. When I told Daniel, he laughed and cried at the same time, pulling me into his arms. "We're ready," he said, as if saying it could make it true. Telling Eleanor was complicated. We invited her to dinner, kept it simple. When we shared the news, she froze, then reached across the table and took my hand. "I will do better," she said, voice thick, "for them." I believed she meant it. Whether she could live up to it remained to be seen, but intention matters. Pregnancy slowed me down in ways I hadn't expected. It gave me time to reflect, to feel my body changing, to imagine the kind of world I wanted to bring a child into. I thought often of my father, of the stories I'd tell, of the lessons I'd pass on. I promised myself that humility would never be taught as shame in our home. As my belly grew, so did Eleanor's efforts. She attended prenatal classes with me once, sitting awkwardly among younger couples, asking earnest questions. She brought books, not about parenting styles, but about emotional intelligence. It was strange and at times tender. Healing, I learned, doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels awkward. The birth was long and exhausting. Daniel never left my side. When our daughter finally arrived, red-faced and perfect, something in me cracked open. Love flooded in, fierce and protective. Eleanor visited the hospital, standing back until invited. When I placed the baby in her arms, she wept openly. "I don't want to repeat my mistakes," she said. "You won't, not if you keep telling the truth." Life with a newborn was chaotic and beautiful. Sleep came in fragments. Joy came in waves. Eleanor respected our boundaries, called before visiting, asked before offering advice. Small things, important things. One afternoon, as I rocked my daughter to sleep, Eleanor watched quietly from the doorway. "You know," she said, "I used to think lineage was everything. Now I think it's the stories we choose to carry forward." I looked down at my child, her tiny hand curled around my finger. "Yes," I said, "and the ones we choose to let go." The foundation continued its work, now with a scholarship cohort named after my father. I attended the first award ceremony with my mother, tears streaming down her face as students spoke about opportunity and support. Eleanor sat beside us, hands folded, eyes shining. When the applause rose, she joined in, wholeheartedly. Later, she turned to my mother and said, "You raised a remarkable woman." My mother smiled gently. We did our best. Watching them together, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed, not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. As my daughter grew, I became more selective with my time. I said no more often. I rested without guilt. I taught her, as she learned to walk, that falling wasn't failure, it was information. One evening, Daniel and I talked about the future, about schools, about values, about how to handle inevitable conflicts. "What if she's treated the way you were?" he asked quietly. I thought about it. I said, "Then we'll teach her to stand, and we'll stand with her." That, I realized, was the final transformation. I was no longer reacting to the past. I was shaping something new. The wedding humiliation had been a catalyst, not a definition. If you're listening to this and you've ever been mocked for where you come from, I want you to hear this clearly. Your beginnings do not limit your ending. Silence can be a strategy, but truth is a legacy. Choose it with care, speak it with grace, and never confuse humility with weakness. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. As my daughter grew from an infant into a curious toddler, I began to understand time differently. Days were long, full of small negotiations and sticky hands, but years moved fast. In that speeding current, I watched old wounds lose their charge, not disappear, just soften. They became lessons instead of aches. That, to me, was the quiet miracle of healing. Eleanor became a regular presence in our lives, though never an intrusive one. She learned, sometimes clumsily, how to ask instead of assume. When my daughter took her first steps, Eleanor clapped from the sidelines, eyes bright, careful not to rush forward. That restraint mattered more than she knew. It told me she was learning where her influence ended. One afternoon, while my daughter napped, Eleanor and I sat at the kitchen table drinking tea. The sunlight fell across the worn wood, a surface far less grand than her own dining table, but warmer. "I've been thinking about that wedding," she said suddenly. I waited. "I was cruel," she continued, "not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I wanted to reassure myself." I nodded. "I know." She looked at me then, really looked. "How did you stay so calm?" I thought about it. "Because anger would have given you power," I said, "and because I knew who I was, even if you didn't." She exhaled slowly. "I wish I'd known who I was at your age." "So do many people," I replied. That conversation marked something subtle but important. Eleanor stopped framing her past behavior as misunderstanding and began calling it what it was. Accountability, even late, carries weight. Daniel noticed the shift too. He became more open with his mother, less defensive. They talked about expectations, about pressure, about the way wealth can distort values if it's not handled carefully. Their relationship didn't become easy, but it became honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was sturdier than comfort. At the foundation, younger board members began seeking me out for mentorship. They'd heard the wedding story, of course. Stories have a way of condensing themselves into myth, but they were more interested in what came after. "How did you keep your integrity without burning bridges?" one asked. I answered truthfully. "By deciding which bridges were worth crossing again," I said, "and by accepting that some will collapse no matter how carefully you walk." The scholarship program expanded, and I insisted on meeting every recipient. I wanted them to see someone who looked like them, spoke like them, understood what it meant to arrive without a safety net. During one meeting, a young woman pulled me aside and whispered, "They said you came from nothing." I smiled gently. "I came from love," I said. "Everything else was built." At home, Daniel and I settled into a rhythm that felt earned. We disagreed sometimes about how much access Eleanor should have, about how transparent to be with extended family. But we talked, we listened, we repaired. That was the difference. We didn't confuse silence with peace. One evening, after putting our daughter to bed, Daniel said, "Do you think your speech changed her, or do you think she was already changing?" I considered it. "I think it gave her a mirror," I said. "What she did with it was her choice." Life tested us again when Whitcomb Industries faced public criticism over a past Weber practice. Old records surfaced, uncomfortable questions followed. This time, the response was different. Instead of denial, there was acknowledgement. Instead of deflection, reform. Eleanor stood beside Thomas at a press conference and said, "We are accountable for the whole of our history, not just the parts that flatter us." I watched from home, my daughter playing at my feet, and felt something like closure. Not vindication, closure. Afterward, Eleanor called me. "I was afraid," she admitted, "but I remembered what you said about interest. The past doesn't disappear." "No," I agreed, "but it can be reconciled." That year, my mother fell ill briefly, nothing serious, but enough to remind me how fragile everything is. Eleanor visited her in the hospital, brought soup she'd made herself, awkward but sincere. My mother thanked her and said, "We all do better when we're honest." Eleanor nodded. "I'm learning." Watching them, I felt a strange gratitude for the path that had brought us here, painful as it was. Without that humiliation, without that reckoning, none of this growth would have happened. It didn't excuse the harm, but it gave it meaning. On the anniversary of the wedding, Daniel asked if I wanted to revisit the venue. I declined. I said, "That place served its purpose. I don't need it anymore." Instead, we went to a small park, pushed our daughter on the swings, laughed when she demanded higher. As she squealed, fearless, I felt a swell of hope. She would grow up knowing that dignity wasn't about status, it was about self-respect. If there's one thing I'd pass on from all of this, it's this. Revenge shouts, justice speaks calmly, and dignity doesn't need an audience to be real, but when it finds one, it teaches. I stayed quiet until it mattered, and when I spoke, I didn't destroy. I revealed. The difference changed everything. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. As the years moved forward, the story of our wedding faded into the background of family lore, no longer whispered with discomfort, but referenced with a kind of careful respect. It became less about what Eleanor had said and more about what followed, what shifted. That mattered to me. I never wanted to be remembered for a single moment of confrontation. I wanted to be remembered for consistency. My daughter started school, a small building with chipped paint and teachers who knew every child by name. Eleanor visited once, standing at the gate, watching children spill out with backpacks nearly bigger than their bodies. "This isn't what I imagined," she said. "It's enough," I replied. She nodded. "Yes, it is." That word, enough, had once been absent from her vocabulary. Everything had been about more prestige, more certainty, more distance from anything that might stain the image she worked so hard to maintain. Now she was learning the relief that comes with sufficiency. At the foundation, our work gained attention beyond our city. Other organizations reached out, curious about our approach to transparency and restorative acknowledgement. I was invited to speak at a conference, not about scandal, but about governance and humility. Standing at the podium, I thought briefly of that wedding microphone, of how different this felt. Then I spoke plainly, as I always had. We don't build trust by pretending we're flawless. We build it by showing how we respond when we're not. Afterward, a man approached me and said, "You're brave." I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I'm practiced." Bravery implies a moment. Practice implies a life. Daniel supported me through all of it, taking on more at home when my schedule grew heavy, never once suggesting I was neglecting anything. We had learned early that partnership isn't about symmetry, it's about responsiveness. When one leans forward, the other steadies. Eleanor struggled with that concept at first. She'd grown up believing roles were fixed, but watching us, she began to ask questions about flexibility, about compromise. One evening, she said, "I thought marriage was about preserving a structure. It's about building one, together." She smiled softly. "I wish someone had told me that." "Someone might have," I said gently. "You might not have been ready to hear it." She laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded. It startled me. It felt like hearing a familiar song played in a new key. Not everything was smooth. There were still moments when old instincts surfaced, an offhand comment, a suggestion framed as advice but edged with judgment. When that happened, I named it calmly. "That feels dismissive," I'd say, or "that assumption isn't accurate." Eleanor would pause, recalibrate, and try again. Repair became a habit. That, more than anything, signaled real change. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents for the Foundation archives, I came across a letter my father had written years before, never sent. It spoke of hope, of believing people could rise to meet their better selves. I read it twice, then placed it carefully in a folder. That letter had carried me through more than one difficult conversation. It reminded me that faith in people doesn't require blindness. It requires boundaries. I shared the letter with Eleanor months later. She read it silently, tears pooling in her eyes. "He believed in us," she whispered. "He believed in doing the right thing," I corrected, "whether people rose to it or not." She nodded. "I want to be worthy of that belief." That was new too, not a performance, not an apology, but aspiration. As my daughter grew older, she began asking questions about family, about money, about why some people live differently than others. I answered honestly, in age-appropriate ways, always anchoring the conversation in values rather than comparisons. Eleanor listened to those conversations with interest, sometimes surprise. She had never been taught to talk about class without judgment. Watching her learn alongside my daughter felt like watching two timelines converge. One day, my daughter asked Eleanor, "Grandma, were you always rich?" Eleanor hesitated, then said, "I was always comfortable, but comfort isn't the same as kindness." My daughter nodded, satisfied. Children have a way of accepting truths adults complicate. The greatest shift came quietly during a holiday dinner. Extended family filled the house, laughter mixing with clinking glasses. A cousin made a comment about those kinds of neighborhoods, the implication hanging in the air. Before I could respond, Eleanor spoke. "We don't talk like that here," she said firmly. "It's lazy." The room went silent. The cousin flushed. Conversation resumed, redirected. I caught Eleanor's eye and inclined my head slightly. She returned the gesture. No words were needed. Later that night, after everyone had left, Eleanor helped clear dishes. She paused, plate in hand, and said, "I think I finally understand what you meant." "About what?" I asked. "About dignity. It's not something you defend, it's something you extend." I smiled. Yes. That understanding didn't erase the past, but it changed the future. And that was enough for me. Years from now, my daughter will hear the story of that wedding. I won't hide it from her. I'll tell her about the sting of being mocked, about the power of patience, about the difference between revenge and revelation. I'll tell her that she stayed quiet until it mattered, not because she was afraid, but because she was choosing her moment. And I'll tell her this: dignity is the real wealth. It can't be inherited, it can't be bought, but once you claim it, no one can take it from you. That's what that day gave me. Not a victory, a voice. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. There is a point in every long story where the tension no longer lives outside you, but inside your memory. By the time my daughter turned 8, the wedding felt like another lifetime, yet it still surfaced in quiet moments, folding laundry, driving familiar roads, hearing laughter sharpened by judgment in a stranger's voice. Trauma doesn't always return as pain. Sometimes it returns as awareness. And awareness, I learned, can be a gift. Eleanor aged during those years, not just physically, though her hair softened to silver and her steps slowed, but emotionally. She grew more contemplative, less certain of her old absolutes. One afternoon, while watching my daughter practice piano, Eleanor said, "I used to believe confidence meant never questioning yourself." "What do you believe now?" I asked. "That confidence is being willing to," she replied. That answer stayed with me because it mirrored my own evolution. I had once equated strength with endurance. Now I understood it as discernment, knowing when to stay, when to speak, when to leave. Daniel and I faced new challenges too. His role at the company expanded, and with it came pressure to conform to old habits. There were board members who wanted the polish without the accountability, who whispered about image management. One night, Daniel came home quiet, shoulders heavy. He said, "They want me to smooth things over, to stop asking hard questions." "And what do you want to do?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes steady. "What you taught me. I want to be honest." That moment mattered. It meant the reckoning hadn't just changed Eleanor, it had reshaped him. Together, we navigated the pushback. Some relationships strained, others fell away. New ones formed, less glamorous, more grounded. At the foundation, a former recipient returned as a volunteer, then a program lead. Watching that full circle reminded me why the work mattered, not for praise, for continuity, for proof that dignity multiplies when shared. One autumn evening, Eleanor invited me to her home alone. No staff, no formalities. She served tea herself, hands trembling slightly. "I'm downsizing," she said, "sorting through things I don't need anymore." She handed me a small box. Inside were letters, correspondence between her and my father from years ago. I hadn't known they'd stayed in touch, even briefly. "I didn't destroy them," she said softly. "I couldn't." I read one aloud, my father's handwriting unmistakable. He'd written about fairness, about doing right by people when no one was watching. My throat tightened. Eleanor wiped her eyes. "I ignored him," she said, "and I paid for it." "You're paying attention now," I replied. "That matters." She nodded. "I wish I'd been kinder when it mattered most." "So do many people," I said gently. "The difference is what they do next." That night, driving home, I realized something profound. Forgiveness hadn't arrived all at once. It had crept in, moment by moment, as Eleanor chose humility over defense. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't forgetting. It's releasing the need for punishment once accountability is present. My daughter, meanwhile, was forming her own sense of justice. She came home one day upset because a classmate had been teased for wearing old shoes. "It wasn't fair," she said. "Everyone laughed." I knelt beside her. "What did you do?" She said, "I didn't laugh," and I sat with her. Pride swelled in my chest. "That's how dignity looks," I told her. At a family gathering later that year, that same classmate came up in conversation. Someone made a careless remark about those families. Before I could respond, my daughter spoke. "That's not nice," she said firmly. "You don't know their story." Silence fell. Then Eleanor smiled, not proudly, but gratefully. I met her eyes. The circle was closing. As Eleanor's health declined, she grew more reflective. One afternoon, sitting in the garden, she said, "Do you think people remember how they made others feel more than what they achieved?" "Yes," I said, "always." She sighed. "Then I have work left to do." "You're doing it every day." When she passed, years later, the service was modest by her standards, but it was full. People spoke honestly, not glossing over her flaws, but honoring her growth. When it was my turn to speak, I said simply, "She learned and she changed." That matters. Afterward, someone asked me how I'd found the strength to speak up at the wedding all those years ago. I thought about it carefully before answering. I wasn't strong. I was prepared. Preparation, I realized, is what turns pain into purpose. If you're listening and carrying a story like mine, where you were underestimated, mocked, diminished, know this: you don't owe anyone silence, but you also don't owe them destruction. The most powerful response is clarity, delivered without cruelty. I stayed quiet until it mattered, And when I spoke, I didn't just expose secrets, I exposed a better way forward. That was the real reckoning. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. After Eleanor's passing, there was a long, quiet season, not just of grief, but of recalibration. When someone who once loomed so large in your life is suddenly gone, you don't just miss them, you notice the space they occupied. The absence reveals how much of your posture, your preparation, your vigilance was shaped in response to them. Letting go of that took time. Daniel grieved in layers. Some days he missed his mother fiercely. Other days he mourned the relationship they could have had sooner if honesty hadn't taken so long to arrive. I gave him space for both. Love, I'd learned, doesn't demand emotional efficiency. The company stabilized after a period of transition. Daniel declined a promotion that would have required compromising the reforms he'd fought for. Instead, he accepted a role that allowed him influence without illusion. "I don't need to be at the top," he said one night. "I need to be able to sleep." I understood that completely. The foundation continued to evolve. New leadership emerged, shaped by values rather than vanity. I eventually stepped back from day-to-day involvement, choosing instead to mentor quietly behind the scenes. Power, I'd discovered, was most effective when it didn't insist on visibility. My daughter entered her teenage years with a confidence that startled me. She questioned teachers respectfully, challenged unfair rules, and spoke openly about privilege in ways that made some adults uncomfortable. One evening, after a school event, she said, "Some parents don't like it when I talk like that." I smiled. Truth often sounds rude to people who benefit from silence. She considered that, then nodded. "Okay." Watching her, I understood the final gift of that wedding day. It had given me a framework, not just for confrontation, but for cultivation. I wasn't raising my child to win arguments. I was raising her to recognize her worth before anyone else tried to define it. Years later, Daniel and I returned to that original wedding venue for a charity event hosted by an unrelated organization. The ballroom looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating, less charged. As we stood near the back, listening to a speaker talk about social mobility and access, Daniel leaned toward me. "Do you feel anything?" he asked. I searched myself honestly. "Gratitude," I said, "and distance." He smiled. "Me too." On the drive home, memories surfaced, not painfully, but clearly. Eleanor's voice, the laughter, my steady breath before speaking. I realized that moment had been a hinge, not a climax. Everything meaningful had come after. People sometimes asked if I regretted not saying more that day, not naming names, not letting anger show. I always answered the same way. No, I said exactly what was needed. Because anger would have turned the story into spectacle, calm turned it into a mirror. As I grew older, I found myself drawn to mentoring women who reminded me of myself, capable, observant, underestimated. They'd ask how to survive hostile rooms, how to respond to subtle cruelty. I never gave them scripts, I gave them principles. Know your truth, document your reality, choose your moment, speak without apology, but without malice. Most of all, don't confuse silence with peace. One woman once asked me, "What if speaking up costs me everything?" I answered carefully, "Then ask yourself what silence is already costing you." That question had guided my life more than any other. On the 20th anniversary of my wedding, Daniel and I hosted a small dinner, friends, family, laughter that felt earned. At one point, my daughter, now grown, raised a glass and said, "To my mother who taught me that dignity doesn't beg." The room went quiet. My throat tightened. I looked at her and saw generations shifting. my parents' sacrifices, my father's quiet integrity, my own refusal to shrink. Later that night, Daniel and I cleaned up together. He said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken?" I nodded. Yes, and I'm grateful every day that I did. Not because it punished anyone, but because it freed me. If this story has taught me anything worth passing on, it's this. You don't have to raise your voice to change the narrative. You don't have to humiliate to reclaim your dignity. And you don't have to come from wealth to understand power. Power is knowing who you are before someone else tries to tell you. I stayed quiet until it mattered, and when I spoke, I chose truth over triumph. That choice shaped a lifetime. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed. The smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. There's a quiet that comes at the end of long reckonings. Not the silence of avoidance, but the stillness of resolution. That's where I find myself now, years removed from the wedding that once felt like a public trial, standing in a life that feels spacious and true. The story no longer tugs at me when I tell it. It rests in me, settled. My daughter is grown now, stepping into her own adulthood with a clarity that both humbles and amazes me. She calls me when she's uncertain, not because she needs answers, but because she trusts reflection. "I'm trying to decide how to respond," she'll say, and I smile, because she understands something I learned the hard way. Response is power. Daniel and I have aged together in the best sense of the word. We've softened without weakening, learned when to lean and when to stand. Our marriage isn't loud. It doesn't perform. It holds. Sometimes late at night, we sit together on the porch, watching the world settle, and he'll say, "I'm still proud of you." Not for the speech, for the steadiness that followed. The foundation eventually renamed its central program to reflect collective contribution rather than a single legacy. I supported that decision. My father's name remains on the scholarship, but the emphasis shifted to shared effort. That felt right. He never wanted a monument. He wanted momentum. When people ask me now about forgiveness, I tell them this. Forgiveness isn't an eraser. It's a boundary. It says, I won't let this define me anymore. I forgave Eleanor not because she deserved absolution, but because I deserved peace, and because she earned accountability through change. I keep one photograph on my desk. It's from years ago. My father standing beside Thomas, both younger, both hopeful. I look at it when I need grounding. It reminds me that dignity often arrives quietly, carried by people who don't insist on credit. Sometimes I replay that wedding day in my mind, not with anger, but with curiosity. I see myself standing there, composed, breathing through the weight of judgment. I recognize her now. She wasn't fearless. She was intentional. And intention, I've learned, is what turns moments into milestones. If you're listening to this and wondering when to speak, I can't tell you the right time, but I can tell you this. Wait until your words are guided by clarity, not rage. Wait until you can tell the truth without needing it to wound. Then speak, calmly, completely, and let the truth do the work. People often confuse revenge with justice. Revenge seeks to diminish. Justice seeks to correct. What happened at my wedding wasn't revenge, it was revelation. And revelation, when handled with grace, has a way of reshaping rooms, families, futures. The laughter that once stung no longer echoes. It's been replaced by conversations that matter, by relationships built on respect rather than performance. That's the real ending, not applause, alignment. I stayed quiet until it mattered. I spoke when my words could stand on their own. And in doing so, I learned that dignity isn't something you defend once. It's something you live every day afterward. Thank you for listening to my story. If it helped you feel less alone or gave language to something you've lived through, then it has done what it was meant to do. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. Sometimes endings don't arrive as doors closing, but as windows opening. That's how this final chapter feels to me. Not like a conclusion stamped in ink, but like air moving freely through a house that once felt sealed tight. If part 11 was about resolution, then this part is about living inside that resolution and understanding what it truly gave me. In the years after everything settled, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I no longer entered rooms scanning for threat or judgment. I no longer rehearsed explanations for my existence. The old reflex to prove myself had softened into something steadier. Presence. I showed up as I was, without apology or performance. That change didn't make life easier in every way, but it made it honest. I began speaking occasionally at small events, libraries, women's groups, community centers, not about the wedding specifically, but about navigating power, silence, and self-respect. Inevitably, someone would ask, "How did you stay calm?" And I would tell them the truth. I wasn't calm because I wasn't hurt. I was calm because I knew who I was. Knowing who you are doesn't eliminate pain, it anchors it. One evening after a talk, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her fiancé's family treated her like a charity case, like she was lucky to be allowed into their world. "They say it with smiles," she said, "so I feel crazy for being hurt." I took her hands and said, "Pay attention to how your body reacts. Discomfort is data, and love doesn't require you to shrink." She nodded slowly, as if something inside her had finally been named. Moments like that reminded me why stories matter. Not because they entertain, but because they validate. They say, "You're not imagining this, and you're not alone." At home, Daniel and I continued building a life that felt increasingly intentional. We downsized once our daughter moved out, choosing simplicity over spectacle. The house was smaller, but it breathed. Light-filled rooms without echo. We laughed more. We rested better. One night, as we organized old boxes, I came across my wedding shoes, still pristine, still elegant. I held them for a long moment, surprised by the absence of bitterness. They no longer felt like relics of endurance. They felt like symbols of initiation. The day I learned I could stand anywhere without bending. I placed them gently back in the box and smiled. My daughter, now living independently, visited often. She carried herself with a quiet assurance that made me proud. She talked openly about boundaries, about equity, about choosing partners who respected her voice. Once, over coffee, she said, "I don't think I could ever marry into a family that looks down on people." I laughed softly. "You'd recognize it early." "Yes," she said, "because you taught me what respect feels like." That, more than anything, felt like legacy. As for Eleanor, I think of her less now, not because she's forgotten, but because she no longer defines any emotional weather in my life. When I do remember her, it's with a kind of compassionate clarity. She was shaped by fear, fear of loss, of irrelevance, of being seen. That fear hardened into cruelty, and while that doesn't excuse harm, it explains it. Understanding isn't agreement, it's release. The wedding that once symbolized judgment has faded into context. People remember it differently now. Some recall the elegance, others the tension. A few still remember the speech. But I remember something else entirely. I remember standing in my truth, unflinching. That moment didn't make me powerful overnight. It made me aligned. And alignment, I've learned, is what sustains power. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to leave you with something simple and real. You don't owe anyone access to your dignity. Not family, not tradition, not wealth. Dignity is not granted by approval. It's generated internally and protected deliberately. You don't have to expose secrets publicly. You don't have to wait for a wedding or a stage. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak clearly in a small room, or walk away without explanation, or choose yourself quietly. I stayed quiet until it mattered because I was listening to my instincts, to my history, to my worth. And when I spoke, I did so not to destroy, but to illuminate. That light changed everything. Thank you for sitting with my story until the end. If it resonated, if it reflected something in your own life, hold on to that recognition. Let it guide you gently, firmly, toward the life you deserve. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. Even after a story feels complete, life keeps offering footnotes, small moments that don't demand attention but quietly confirm that the lessons held. This part of my life isn't dramatic. There are no grand confrontations left, and yet it may be the most meaningful chapter of all. I've learned that healing shows up in ordinary decisions, in how you answer a question without second-guessing yourself, in how you decline invitations that once would have fed your ego but drained your spirit, in how your body relaxes when you no longer anticipate being judged. Years ago, I would have entered certain rooms braced for impact. Now I enter only the rooms that feel aligned. And if alignment is impossible, I don't enter at all. That shift surprised some people. There were acquaintances who preferred the version of me that was careful, accommodating, endlessly gracious. When I stopped explaining myself, a few relationships thinned out. I let them. Growth has a way of clarifying who benefits from your silence. One afternoon, I ran into an old wedding guest at a bookstore. She recognized me immediately and said, "I still remember your speech. I think about it more than I should." I smiled and said, "I hope you remember how it made you feel." She paused. "It made me reflect on how I treat people." That was enough. You never really know how far your words travel. You only know why you release them. I've also become gentler with my younger self. For a long time, I critiqued her patience, wondering if I waited too long to speak. Now, I see her wisdom. She was gathering information, building internal scaffolding, learning the difference between reaction and response. She wasn't weak. She was discerning. That distinction matters. There's a cultural urgency around speaking up immediately, calling out instantly, performing outrage in real time. But there is another kind of courage, the courage to observe, to prepare, to choose timing over volume. That courage saved me. When my daughter comes to me with conflicts now, I don't rush to tell her what to do. I ask her what outcome she wants: peace, change, distance, clarity. Because how you speak depends on why you're speaking. She's learned that too. Once, she told me about a situation at work where a colleague repeatedly dismissed her ideas. I could call him out in the meeting, she said, or I could document everything and bring it to my supervisor. What feels most like you? I asked. She thought for a moment. The second option, quiet but firm. I nodded. Then trust that. Watching her make that choice felt like watching the future repair the past. Daniel and I celebrated another anniversary recently. No party, no speeches, just a long walk, a shared meal, and the comfort of knowing we've weathered storms without losing ourselves. At one point, he said, "Do you know what I admire most about you?" I raised an eyebrow. This should be good. He smiled. You don't confuse forgiveness with access. I laughed softly because that truth took me years to learn. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean inviting harm back in. It means releasing yourself from the burden of carrying what no longer serves you. Boundaries are not bitterness. They are clarity in action. As time goes on, fewer people ask me about the wedding itself. They ask about how to recover from disrespect, how to maintain dignity when surrounded by arrogance, how to stay soft without becoming small. I tell them this: softness and strength are not opposites. Softness without boundaries invites harm. Strength without softness invites loneliness. The balance is where peace lives. If you've listened this far, maybe you're still carrying something unresolved, a moment where you swallowed your truth, a room where you felt invisible, a relationship where your worth was quietly questioned. I want you to know this: the story doesn't end at the moment of humiliation. That moment is just information. What you do afterward, that's the real narrative. You may never get a microphone, you may never expose secrets publicly, and that's okay. Most reckonings happen privately, in decisions that no one applauds. What matters is this: you don't internalize someone else's cruelty, you don't measure your value by their approval, and you don't rush your healing to make others comfortable. I stayed quiet until it mattered because I trusted myself enough to wait. And when I finally spoke, whether aloud or through action, I did so with integrity. That integrity became my compass. This isn't a revenge story in the way some expect. It's a reclamation story, a reminder that dignity is not fragile, even when tested, especially when tested. And with that, I let this story rest. I stayed quiet while my mother-in-law laughed about where I came from, right there at my wedding. She thought my past made me small. She didn't know my silence was preparation. When I finally spoke, the room changed, the smiles froze, and the truth she buried for decades came up dressed in white. There's a moment later in life when you realize the story you once survived has quietly become a story you steward, not because you relive it, but because it shaped how you walk through the world now. That's where I stand today, not inside the memory, but downstream from it. I notice it in how I listen to people. I no longer rush to fill silences. I let them speak themselves into clarity. I learned long ago that people reveal far more when you give them space than when you confront them too quickly. Eleanor taught me that without meaning to. Her cruelty was loud, but her fear was louder if you listened carefully. After everything, I became more attentive to power dynamics that once felt invisible. At dinners, at meetings, at family gatherings, I noticed who interrupted whom, whose stories were laughed at, whose credentials were questioned. I didn't always intervene, but when I did, it was deliberate. A question redirected, a credit reassigned, a silence broken gently but unmistakably. One time, at a charity board meeting, a young woman presented an idea that was immediately dismissed by an older member. I watched her shoulders tighten, the familiar retreat beginning. I remembered that feeling in my own body decades earlier, so I spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. I'd like to hear her finish. I think there's something there we're missing. The room shifted. The woman met my eyes, startled. She finished. The idea passed unanimously. Afterward, she thanked me. I told her the truth. You already had the idea. I just made room. That's what dignity does. It creates room. Daniel once told me he thinks the most radical change in me wasn't that I learned to speak up, but that I learned to stop apologizing for existing. I hadn't noticed it myself until he said it, how often I used to soften statements with qualifiers, how often I smiled to preempt discomfort. Those habits didn't disappear overnight, but they loosened their grip. I don't believe people are obligated to confront every slight. Sometimes survival requires discretion. But I do believe that unexamined silence becomes a habit, and habits become identities if we're not careful. I refused to let silence define me. As years passed, new challenges arrived, as they always do. Losses, transitions, moments of self-doubt that crept in quietly. But I met them differently. I trusted my capacity to endure without disappearing. That trust came from knowing I had faced something deeply humiliating and walked through it with my sense of self intact. That knowledge is portable. It travels with you. Occasionally, someone will still bring up the wedding, usually in hushed tones, as if afraid it might reopen something painful. I reassure them. It doesn't hurt anymore, I say. It taught me. And that's the truth. Pain that transforms becomes wisdom. Pain that's denied becomes residue. I think often about people who never get the moment I had. No stage, no speech, no public reckoning. Their dignity is challenged quietly, persistently, in places where resistance feels dangerous. To them, I want to say this: your worth is not diminished by your silence, but your silence deserves examination, care, and eventually release. Release doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means departure. Sometimes it means redefining what family, loyalty, or success looks like for you. Sometimes it means choosing peace over proximity. My life today is not impressive by society's loudest measures. It's not filled with extravagance or validation from powerful people. But it is spacious, it is honest, and it is mine. In quieter moments, I think of my father again, his hands, his patience, the way he taught me that work done with integrity doesn't need witnesses to be meaningful. I wish he could see how far his influence traveled, not into wealth, but into resilience. I like to think he would smile at the woman I've become, not because I stood my ground once, but because I kept standing afterward, day after day, without hardening. If this story lingers with you, I hope it's not because of the humiliation or the secrets or the drama. I hope it lingers because it reminds you that dignity is renewable. You can reclaim it at any age, in any season, after any mistake or silence. You are not late to your own voice. I stayed quiet until it mattered. I spoke when my truth was ready. And then I lived in a way that honored both choices. That balance, that discernment, is what carried me here. Thank you for walking with me through every part of this story. Sometimes the most powerful endings aren't loud. They're steady, and they last.